Are we on with? We're on or not? We're on here. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you back here to our reading room for a program. This program for members and shareholders is a collaboration between the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, and Monticello, and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello. We're very grateful for, especially for those of you here tonight who represent the intersection of those circles on our Venn diagram. I wanted to especially Ann Lucas and our trustees Ann Lucas and Bob Demento, who have been instrumental in helping put this program together. So thank you very much. I also want to welcome all of you who are, I'm not sure what camera, look at this camera. That looks like the one I should be talking to, but I want to thank all of you who have tuned in tonight on Zoom. This is another experiment of ours where we are going to be having a live event and a simulcast event. I'm sure many of you have done this before, but we are still working out the bugs, so continue to be patient. Figure this out. Those of you who are at home or watching remotely over the course of the evening, use the chat function for that. And as we move forward, or as we come to the question period at the end of Andrew's talk, I will pass along the questions to him. And then we'll have questions both from our in-person audiences and from the internet, all of you out there. Without my saying anything going any farther, I would like to introduce Andrew O'Shaughnessy here, who will be talking to us tonight about his latest book, The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, about the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's great project. Andrew O'Shaughnessy is the Vice President of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello and the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. His previous books include An Empire Divided, The American Revolution, the British Caribbean, and The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, which is the winner of the George Washington Book Prize. We are very, very pleased to have you here. Please welcome to the library.
I'm very grateful to the Library Company and to Mark Vicente for this invitation, and also to the collaborators. It's very nice to have Bob Hauser here, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society, and Lucas from Monticello, who's been extremely helpful in arranging this event, and Bob Demento, who's both a friend of the Library Company and also of Monticello. I was here in Philadelphia for a year on a fellowship at the McNeil Center and benefited from this collaboration. It's a marvelous city. This is a great organization. I remember looking at a document from the time of the Stamp Act, and it still had a stamp on it because it was from the British Caribbean, where they'd not burned these stamps. Among philatelists, these are huge collector's items. Very few stamps remain. The Americans pretty well destroyed them all, so there are very few. And so it's a remarkable thing in itself, and just one example of the treasures that are housed here. The headline of this book is that there really is no other head of state in world history who spent so long conceiving and then implementing their vision for a university. Either a head of state or former head of state. Indeed, there are many individuals who founded universities. Rice was founded by an individual. So was the University of North Carolina. You go early in history, William of Wykeham founded New College, Oxford, many monarchs and aristocratic patrons. some of whom had something to do with the curriculum, but I cannot think of any individuals who are involved in such an all-encompassing way. As an architect, Jefferson designed the university very famously. If we can go to the next slide. He designed the university, and typically he didn't just design it, he also wanted it to be a lesson in architectural history and to teach the 6 classical orders to the students. And he also wanted it to be a model of what a good university would be. I've never seen architectural historians try and estimate the cost of this set of buildings in relation to other public buildings in the period, but it must be one of the 3rd largest public buildings of the period after the Erie Canal and the building of Washington, D.C. In fact, one historian estimated that it cost more than the entire endowment and income since its founding, which gives you a sense of how expensive it was. As the son of a surveyor, he, with 10 very likely enslaved workers, surveyed the land, took his own twine with him, his own measuring pieces. An intellectual, he designed the curriculum. As a bibliophile, he wrote out a list of well over 6,000 books for the library, and the library instantly became the 2nd largest library, co-equal with Yale, among any universities in America. Only Harvard was larger. And remember, Harvard had been founded 2 centuries earlier. And he designed the courses as well, the curriculum, paying particular interest in the law curriculum. Here you see his list of books in Anglo-Saxon. Some people today think of him as someone who promoted STEM, a very much practical syllabus, but he thought Anglo-Saxon an essential subject for students to study, and I can discuss why later. He also was not only the first rector of the university, he was secretary to the board of visitors, and he wrote out all of the minutes. This is probably the task that most of us try and avoid on any committee, but this was really very clever because, of course, if you write the minutes, you're the one who essentially summarizes the decisions and get to put your own slant on the meeting. And one of the themes that comes through in this book is the political savviness of Jefferson. I mean, he was really at his most mature. Remember, most of this was done between the ages of 73 and 83. And he was at his politically best in terms of his experience, and of course, sometimes really quite devious. He also entertained and knew every student at the university. He would invite them to Monticello, usually in groups of 3 or 4 on a Sunday evening, and he would often show them this document, which is the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. He was always more proud of the first draft than the one that was edited by Congress. He would relay anecdotes of Washington and Franklin. Those were his 2 favorite founders to talk about. There is actually a detailed description by someone called Henry Tyrwhitt, who was a student at the university, of going to one of these dinners. And they described how Jefferson, in the last year of his life, the year the university was opened, his hearing was going, and he was getting a bit deaf, and he deliberately pushed his chair back from the table at dinner because he wanted to see these students talk with each other. And he also described how Jefferson's daughter presided, Martha Randolph, and that she would gently tease Jefferson during these dinners. And she, for example, talked about how she loved reading novels and that Jefferson didn't like novels, and that she'd given him a copy of a Sir Walter Scott novel and he hadn't liked it. But then she was even more mischievous because she said what she really loved reading was Sir William Blackstone's commentaries on the English law. Now, this is no bedtime reading, and it was quite deliberately teasing him because Jefferson regarded Blackstone's commentaries as essentially dangerous for American students to read, that they would turn American students into monarchists and into Tories, and he did not want them introduced to that book, at least in the introductory law courses. He knew it was one of the easiest books to read summaries of the legal system, but he didn't want them introduced to it. Incidentally, it was the most popular book in the library, which shows how the students were able to subvert Jefferson. Some of these students that he was inviting were as young as 16, and they would spell the word republic with a B. There's one recollection of one professor. Jefferson regarded the university as one of his three greatest achievements in life, which he wanted inscribed on his tomb, beginning with author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and then father of the University of Virginia. But it's always been just treated as a sort of epilogue to Jefferson's career, and has certainly never received the attention of many of his other achievements. And my book is really arguing that it was in some ways on a par with those other achievements, especially if we look at his broader plan for education, and that it's still worth our engaging with his idea of university, partly because it was so creative. It was also dealing with what is a perennial problem to this day as to what role education should play in a system based on representation and on elected leaders. And also, and perhaps most importantly, his university had a major impact, as I document in the book, on higher education more generally in America. The university was just the apex of a much larger educational vision for Jefferson. In 1779, in a bill for the general diffusion of knowledge in Virginia, at a time when one might have focused more on the fact that Virginia was being invaded regularly by the British, Jefferson put forward a bill that would have essentially created the first public system of schools, primary schools for both boys and girls, which was revolutionary at the time, anywhere in the world. The Scottish and also some of the New England states, especially Massachusetts and Connecticut, had very high levels of literacy and of schooling, but they hadn't fully evolved a public school system. Prussia and even Austria had issued diktats for a public school system, but even they had not created it. The Prussians were generally regarded as the pioneers, but much of that was in the early 19th century. Now, like the Declaration of Independence, there were many flaws in his vision of a university. He wanted the university to provide scholarships for poor children. He recognized that, that those who were poor could be intellectually able and were simply held back by their means. But it in actual fact became the most expensive university in America, other than Harvard, almost right up through to the Civil War. He wanted it to be devoted to the illimitable freedom of the human mind, but as my anecdote about Blackstone indicates, he also wanted it to be teaching what he regarded as the revolutionary spirit of America, and specifically the Republican ideas, and essentially his own ideology. And like all universities in the South, it was tainted by the presence of slavery, and that has been a major focus recently in the work on the university, a very justified focus and an essential corrective to earlier histories, and also very important for helping the university confront this past, and especially the legacy of segregation that continued to the 1970s that followed it. Nevertheless, the criticisms have given a somewhat critical view of the university, a view that is perhaps best summarized by Roger Geiger's monumental work on the history of universities in America up to the end of the Second World War. And I would say it's an exceptionally good summary of university histories. Nevertheless, in his summation on the University of Virginia, he says this was largely just a finishing school for planter aristocrats and really no model for anywhere. So while I recognize the limitations of the university, the fact that the primary scholarships never appeared until the about 20 years after the university was founded, and especially I include a lot of the recent work and discoveries about slavery at the university. Nevertheless, this book argues that, like the Declaration of Independence, the university was really very radical and very revolutionary in many of its ideas and in its influence on higher education in America. And for much of the rest of this talk, I will be speaking about those. But before I speak about the ideas themselves, their impact, I did want to just say a word about how helpful it was to write this book at Monticello. If I can plagiarize from the lyrics of a musical I see you have going on here in town, this was the room where it happened, or rather this was the house where it happened. You can see the desks in which he designed the buildings for the university, the library that was so important in influencing his choice of books at the university, and many of the features that he would transplant and copy to the university. In many ways, it was like a mini laboratory itself. But even more important for me, working on the book there, was to have the Jefferson Papers, 10 people working on the retirement papers, Thomas Jefferson, producing one volume each year, all letters that relate to Jefferson in the period of his life when he was designing the university. So these are critical documents. Only at least about 2/5 of those letters by Jefferson have never been published, while the letters he received, about 3/5 have never been published. And these are the definitive edition. And it helped me in major ways. A lot of what is original to this book is thanks to the Papers project, and just something simple like telling the story of the foundation laying stone ceremony in which 3 presidents were present: Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And Monroe at the time was the sitting president. I've only really ever seen a paragraph about that event, yet clearly it must have been recorded in great detail, and it was by the Freemasons who oversaw the ceremony. And of course, it was again Jefferson at his political best, realizing you have 3 presidents there. It's a way of attracting attention and attracting money. The university at the time was called Central College. It was a private university, and it was essentially his attempt to start building the University of Virginia, which he wanted the public to adopt, and this was part of it. Jefferson also, this is again thanks to the Jefferson Papers, he'd already drafted what was known as the Rockfish Gap Commission. That is regarded as the blueprint of the university. It stated there were some 22 commissioners, and at a place called Rockfish Gap between Charlottesville and Stanton, they set out the curriculum, every detail of the university. But thanks to the Jefferson Papers, we know that Jefferson had already drafted their findings before they ever met, and had done 3 different drafts. Clearly, each time the political attraction was very important because he wanted the legislature to then adopt the commission report. His big case was to make the case that it should be in Charlottesville, the most central part of Virginia, according to the way he calculated it. Again, his method of calculation involved certain element of deception. We also have the Getting Word project, which is a project that has interviewed some 300 descendants of enslaved people at Monticello, some of those people who were also to work at the University of Virginia, families like the Grangers and of course the Hemmingses. This adds a great deal. We're very fortunate in the material available for this period. It's the best documented period of Jefferson's life. So we've even got some records from enslaved people themselves, like Isaac Granger, who left a memoir that he had dictated. 2 English feminists, early English feminists, Frances Wright and Harriet Martineau. Frances Wright actually visited Monticello with the Marquis de Lafayette, but Harriet Martineau visited after Jefferson's death. It gives us an account of the university very soon afterwards. And with this material, I'm able to begin each chapter with extended stories. I gave you an example of one such with the dinner at Monticello, narrated by Henry Tyrrell. Others, I start the chapter on architecture with his meeting with Maria Cosway and his seeing a DeLorme dome the very first time. His chapter on religion with a description of his editing the Gospels and literally cutting and pasting. He began that while he was president, but he resumed that project the very same year that the bill went forward to create the University of Virginia, and the 2 were importantly linked. So let me now turn to what was distinctive about his vision in relation to other universities in America and elsewhere, and how it influenced other universities. One of the most important features was that it was a secular university. There was no chapel, no department of theology, and this was revolutionary at the time. Other colleges had tried this, University of North Carolina and Transylvania. They had abandoned it. And the University of Virginia became the first university to have a Jewish professor, Joseph Sylvester. He was especially remarkable. He was responsible for introducing Hebraic terms into mathematics, Hebraic symbols. He was responsible for the word graph. I'd had one of the first Catholic professors in America, Hungarian Catholic. That's, of course, we forget just how much anti-Catholicism there was during the 19th century. And we forget, too, that at any other college in America, you're expected to go to chapel, not just on Sunday, but twice a day. And that there was religious tolerance. There was no test act in America, so you didn't have to swear to a particular denomination, but it was tolerance among different Protestant religions. So there would be Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Episcopalians could work with each other and attend the same university, but it was not truly tolerant in a way that we might think. The other thing about his vision was secular. He also introduced the idea of an elective curriculum. And this had been tried in France and in Germany previously. A lot of these ideas he transplanted, but as with so much with Jefferson, he gave it his own unique synthesis. An elective curriculum is one in which the students choose their own courses and choose what they want to study first. Students at the university did not go through as a class because they went through at their own rate, starting with any course they liked. The only requirement was that they confine themselves to 3 subjects. In some ways, it gave them greater flexibility than today because they weren't required to do foundational subjects. And I would point out that an elective curriculum has become one of the hallmarks of higher education in America. And it's well worth remembering that at this time, if you'd gone to Harvard, you would have studied many different subjects. So you would have had to progress as a class and study them in exactly the order that the university required. And as Bernard Bailyn, whose first and earliest work was on education, as he pointed out, there was no sort of meaning to the way that the courses were arranged, even though, of course, Harvard in that period produced some remarkable figures. Furthermore, Jefferson put emphasis on having an outstanding faculty, really an A-list faculty. This is one of them, Rob Lee Dunglinson, who was the first professor of medicine at the university. And he was really the first true professor of medicine, because although there had been earlier professors, like here in the University of Pennsylvania, he was not allowed to practice medicine or to have a job on the side. And the same was true of the professor of law. He was to be a professional academic. And Dunglinson became known as the father of American physiology. He spent his later career here in Philadelphia. He was one of 3 professors who was a member of the American Philosophical Society, like Jefferson himself. And also, I think, is an example of the incredibly distinguished faculty. There was an emphasis in the curriculum on the sciences and also on vocational subjects like medicine and law. And it's well worth remembering that only 2 years after Jefferson died, Yale produced what was called the Yale Report, one of the most influential documents in American higher education. Yale was undoubtedly the leader in American education at the time. It had taught most of the heads of colleges, and a large number of faculty, more so than any other university. And the Yale report basically was reasserting the value of the classics as the central element of any curriculum. Jefferson included the classics on the curriculum, but they were not required. You did not have to do Latin and Greek, and after a few years, they didn't even require a basic test in Latin to get into the university. George Tucker was another of these early professors, one of the first to teach economics, regarded as the finest economist in the South and one of the best in America at the time. He also wrote the first science fiction novel about a trip to the moon, and wrote other novels, one on the Shenandoah Valley, in which he went and lived in primitive conditions in the frontiers of the state in order to write the novel. He and Robert Duncanson, both members of the American Philosophical Society, produced a journal while they were at the university that was a scientific journal, an academic journal. They disagreed as to the extent it should have poetry and literature in it. Tucker wanted more, Duncanson wanted less. You do get a sense of real academic life in the early period of this university. Jefferson, shortly before he died, wrote, "The state in which I live is now engaged in the establishment of a university in which all the sciences will be cultivated, which the circumstances of our country would as yet render useful. This institution will employ the remaining days and faculties of my life, will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind." And it was an obsessive project. He even supervised the buildings in the early period, gave calculations as to every brick which would be required for each building, calculations for the cost of the buildings, which he always underestimated. And he left the most expensive building to the very end. When questioned by someone as to why he did this, and unfortunately his answer got into the local newspaper, he said, "You can't force more than one hot potato down a man's throat at a time." The governance structure of the university was going to be very different. No college president, which remained true up until 1900. The students were also going to have a large part in governing themselves. One of the reasons I think we just don't remember Jefferson's contribution is either it's become so commonplace, like an elective curriculum, that it no longer would seem remarkable, or it was abandoned by his own university, and certainly the governance schemes were abandoned. But what he wanted was to have a university, much like William and Mary had been when he was there in 1760. These were his three great mentors: George Wythe, later the first professor of law; William Small, a Scottish Enlightenment figure, the only lay professor at the university; Governor Francis Fakir, who used to have musical evenings, academic evenings, which just a small group of them would gather. That's what Jefferson wanted for the University of Virginia. He wanted it to be paternal, the idea of the professor as a father figure, the professors living among these students in pavilions and dining with the students as well in what today we would think of as cafeterias. What attracted me in some ways to this project was the sheer creativity of Jefferson's vision that I think is still worth engaging. We're very lucky to have in the audience Doug Hansberg, who's written more about his ideas for the dome of the rotunda, what was going to be the library building and the construction of that dome. I must say I rather oversimplify his findings by saying he was thinking of having a planetarium, which is not a word you use for deliberate reasons, in the dome itself, where a professor on a boomstick, steered by students sitting on a saddle on the boomstick, would be able to guide you through the planets. He did see astronomy as the most sublime of the sciences, but it's just marvelous. It's sort of the idea of having a visual aid. What I also found remarkable about his vision was how comprehensive it was. It would involve museums and art galleries, all of which were part of the university. He also wanted to make a lot free to the public, the museums, the art galleries. Lectures, it seems, many of them could be attended by local people. In fact, we have one account of a science lecture being attended by both men and women, though women technically were not allowed, there couldn't be students at the university. There was also a free clinic run by the medical school for local people. Now, it's very difficult to ever demonstrate impact on other universities because, rather like the University of Virginia, which was partly inspired in the early period by the University of Pennsylvania, by Edinburgh University, but later on, Jefferson became more interested in German universities like Göttingen and the University of Berlin. And this would be true of other universities, that they have multiple influences. Nevertheless, we can document a direct influence. Surprisingly, the most direct was on Harvard. While Jefferson was completing the university, he was in regular contact with two of the rising faculty stars at Harvard, George Tickner, who is regarded as one of the fathers of the teaching of modern languages, especially Spanish, and Edward Everett, who later became president of Harvard. They were able to help Jefferson because they were studying in Germany. In fact, Everett was the first American to gain a PhD, which was unknown. It's very much a German innovation. And soon after Jefferson died, Josiah Quincy, the new president of Harvard, before he'd been installed, was on his way down and had reached as far as Washington to visit Charlottesville and had to turn around. He was very anxious to see it because they were in lockdown. They had a typhoid epidemic at the university. George Tickner said that the German model was so important, but that we didn't have anything that we could point to in America that attempted to realize these ideas. Now, UVA was therefore terribly important. Charles Walker Eliot, Charles William Eliot, rather, was even more interested in trying to take the idea of the elective curriculum from the University of Virginia and introduce it to Harvard. As late as the 1960s, James Brown Conan did a book on Jefferson's education ideas that was intended not just for an audience within the universities, but audience of school teachers and the general public. And these aren't just Harvard presidents, these are some of the most influential presidents in its history. William Barton Rogers, the first president of MIT, had been a faculty member at the University of Virginia and introduced many of the features of the University of Virginia. Jefferson was a celebrity in his own lifetime. Anything he was doing was huge interest throughout America. Even the arrival of professors from Britain, where he recruited the majority of his faculty, was reported in New England newspapers. And his influence, of course, was especially strong in the South. Edward Everett, later president of Harvard, wrote an article about the university just before it opened, in which he examined the Rockfish Gap report and talked about its strengths and weaknesses in the North American Review. So that really helped to popularize the idea. And what he stressed more than anything else was that this is a public university and one of the first true public universities. It was the second only to receive annual income from the state, the University of South Carolina being the first. Interestingly, the South really pioneered public education. The first charter was the University of Georgia. University of North Carolina was the first really to come into existence. Georgia existed on paper, which is why you see they both claim to be the first in their literature. Places like what was then South Carolina College, became the University of South Carolina. And because the North was the buckle of the Bible Belt at the time, not the South, it was considerably more freedom in terms of the curriculum, more emphasis on vacations, more emphasis on science. This, though, is neither an American university that I just showed, that is University College London. And Jefferson sent the founder of that, Lord Brougham, and at the time the project was essentially on hold, a copy of the Rockfish Gap Commission. And University College London was the first university founded outside of Oxford and Cambridge in England. And in virtually every way, it is similar to the University of Virginia, a secular college. Joseph Sylvester, the first Jewish professor, was at college here, and he was taught by a former professor from the University of Virginia. Two of its first professors were Thomas Keyes and George Long, both of whom had previously taught at the University of Virginia. And normally, of course, what was happening in American education was not being copied in Europe. But because it was Jefferson, there was real interest. And so these are literally words in the last year of his life and closing last scenes of life by fostering and fashioning an establishment, the instruction of those who have come after us. I hope its influence on their virtue, freedom, fame, and happiness will be salutary and permanent. The point is, Jefferson understood the limitations of his own age. As the person who coined the word Enlightenment said, it was an age of an enlightenment, but it was not an enlightened age. And Jefferson predicted that he and his own contemporaries would one day be looked upon just like their witch-burning ancestors. They'd be seen as very backward. But that was the whole point of a university. The university was for each new generation to bring about progress based on reason, based on science, based on the best thinking. One of his favorite phrases is that the earth belongs to the living. It should not be held back by the dead hand of the past. He realized that the future may go in a contrary to his own beliefs, although he hoped that it would be one to recognize the importance of those three achievements on his gravestone: political freedom and religious freedom, which he thought essential for intellectual freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We will be going to turn to you, Dana, and see if we have any questions. Rachel, in the back room. Do we have any questions in the room? John.
You mentioned Benjamin Franklin.
Yes.
How would you compare and contrast their?
You know, I was surprised that Jefferson didn't own Franklin's works on education, but he spent so much time with Franklin, and he lived up here in Philadelphia. It's impossible he was not unaware of Franklin's importance. And Franklin is one of the few of his contemporaries who'd also been involved in founding a university, but of course never got to mold that university in a way that he really wanted to. He felt that the trustees lifted the project from him. He didn't want to teach Latin here and really be something of a trade school. But I think there are a lot of similarities. The belief in the value of teaching vocational subjects. Jefferson wanted tradesmen on what in any other university we'd call the campus. In UVA, it has its own term, the lawn or the grounds, larger area, showing their skills and trades so that students could learn practical skills. There's no doubt he himself knew how to make things, knew how to do woodwork and build. He got his tools, and he was able to instruct craftsmen of the university in very specific ways how he wanted things made. So there's that practical element, the idea of having scholarship and making it open, and the idea, the belief to some extent in some kind of meritocracy, that people of different backgrounds could and should aspire to being able to go to university and to have an influence. Now, Franklin went beyond Jefferson in actually putting forward the idea of a school for African American children. Although there's a little known correspondence in 1794 by a Quaker called Peasants, in which he asked Jefferson to support the idea, the school for African Americans. And Jefferson replied, I'm in favor, but why segregate? Why don't you revive my plan for public education system? And he pointed out that I never said in that plan that it should exclude African Americans. In other words, he didn't close that, even though he made very little effort to educate his own enslaved people and showed very little interest in that. He was in favor of them being able to read, but not to write, or didn't. Many of them did. That is what is so remarkable. But I would give Franklin great credit because this was all before the revolution, not afterwards. And that's what's so remarkable. Whereas I see the real impetus for Jefferson being the revolution.
We have had a question come in. I'm just going to step around you so I can read it up.
Yes, and if you want to read it.
So Patrick, I think this might be Patrick Spiro, asks, in your book, you point out that Jefferson said that history was perhaps the most important subject to learn. Was there anything distinctive in terms of Jefferson's curriculum when it came to teaching or reading in U.S. history? Then what would be considered a relatively new history for a young nation?
Yes. So I was disappointed, given that all of them, and this was true of all the founders, really emphasized the importance of history. But there's no plan for an actual history department that didn't come until much later in the 19th century. On the other hand, American history and recent history would be taught as part of the rhetoric courses and in other fields. And he didn't just want people getting classical history. One of the problems is there were only 8 professors, and he called it a university, and it was smart because about only 30 institutions using that term at the time in America. The idea is it's universal knowledge, and there was an element of the idea of graduate schools in different departments. But they were trying to cover too much. And Edward Everett critiqued his plan and said, no professor can teach all of these subjects. And George Long taught ancient languages and said, I expected to teach Hebrew. I've never studied Hebrew. I don't know how to teach Hebrew. And some of them swapped among each other. They all admitted to being overwhelmed by the expectations. George Tucker, who's the oldest of them, who'd been a senator before, incidentally, he tried to hire the Attorney General of the United States to be his law professor. He did not aim low with these appointments, but they often felt inadequate, and virtually none of them had any teaching. There was not an academic career system in this period. Even the word profession only comes later in the 19th century. Many of these people went between school teaching, university, or more typically, they were clergymen who would go teach early in their career and then go into a career in the church. Jefferson specifically did not want clergy teaching at the university, which really limited his choices in America. It also meant a lot of these professors treated these students a bit like children. At Harvard, you could enter at the age of 12. I think Edward Everett was 13 when he went to Harvard. Jefferson was really setting a higher boundary by insisting there'd be no younger than 16. And he was very proud that 16 and 17-year-olds were only 1/5 of the entire university.
I had a couple of questions.
Yes.
I'm standing, so I
Yes.
At our recent event, the library company hosted, we had Alan Taylor speak.
Yes.
And he talked about how important for Jefferson and for others of the founders, education was as a bulwark of democracy. That the founders understood that there had been no successful democracy, and that they felt that education was the key to making sure that people would not become vulnerable to what we're seeing. And so in thinking about the curriculum, or thinking about how Jefferson thought about the curriculum, how do you see that idea of developing citizens and developing functioning members of democracy? Where do you see the marks of that in his ideas about?
Well, of course, it was most prominent in his plans for public education, for primary schools, so that they'd be educated enough to hold accountable those who'd been to university and were the leaders in the legislatures. And people always say that Jefferson just abandoned public schools for this elitist project. He did not. His plan for public education didn't get passed. And one of the main reasons, he brought forward 3 bills, including one shortly before the end of his life. The reasons they kept failing is he didn't want clergy teaching in schools, and he didn't want them to be denominational. People also take him to task for having essentially undermined a rival plan for a public school system in Virginia by Charles Fenton Mercer. Mercer was a Presbyterian and a Federalist. Jefferson felt the Presbyterians and Federalists had gained a stranglehold on the American education system, and that this was a backdoor to essentially evangelizing America and controlling its system. A lot of people think it's sinister that Jefferson said we don't want our Southern students going to the North for their education. But he first started saying this, and he'd said it about students being educated in Europe. He first started saying this in the 1790s, and slavery was not the big issue between the North and the South. And his real concern was that Northern universities were Federalist, Presbyterian, or Congregational, and that his biggest opponents led those universities. The worst was Timothy Dwight at Yale, who actually told his students to pledge not to vote for Jefferson, and used some of the most fierce rhetoric against Jefferson in the election of 1800, saying he'd turn the country into atheists and force everyone to learn to sing the Cha-Ra, the French Revolutionary anthem, that they'd have to immerse themselves in Tom Paine. And that was the year that Jefferson first put forward the plan for the University of Virginia. Interestingly, to Joseph Priestley, a Unitarian, someone who would have understood his religious concerns and his desire to free education from the control of religious denominations. He would have argued he didn't want them to be atheists, but that they must make their own choices as students. Incidentally, it's also popular to point out the number of riots and the insurrection among the students in this early period. And of course, people who write about the university love to play that up because it makes for fun reading. And the very first riot was while Jefferson was still alive. And my chapter on the students begins with him crying in front of the entire student body. All of the board of visitors of the university, including Madison and Monroe, and all of the professors, because of a riot that occurred. And they finally convinced the student leaders to come forward, and it turned out the riot had been led by his own great nephew, which made it especially embarrassing. But Jefferson himself said there were three types of students at this university. There are really outstanding, a third who are outstanding, a third who are pretty good, nothing special, and then a third that he called idle ramblers, capable of focus. And I talk about the top third, what they went on to achieve. Someone like Henry Tirrett, who addressed the Alumni Association marked the 50th year of the opening of the university, who'd had a career of anti-slavery, who'd been a founding president of the University of Alabama, who opened one of the first mixed academies. His daughter went on to be one of the first female principals of a college, and the way that they would try and continue this quite progressive Jefferson tradition. I also point out that Harvard was far more volatile in the same period than the University of Virginia. Harvard did not have many Southern students, and the riots at Yale and Princeton are often blamed on Southerners. 96% of students at Harvard came from Massachusetts, mostly from Boston, and yet they were sending down half classes. John Quincy Adams, his own son, President Quincy Adams, was sent down from Harvard, and not even the intervention of his father was able to get him back into college. Prescott, the great historian, wrote about the conquistadors and the Spanish Americas. He was partly blinded by one of these, I think it was called the pudding rat at Harvard, when he got bread crusts in his eye, and it led to his decline. Edward Everett got very quickly fed up of being president and said, "I'm tired of being nothing more than a schoolmaster and having to sort of correct these students for their behavior. That is this all I was made for?"
Is there a reason why the Jefferson never enclosed what? Philosophically or technically?
Yes.
Is there any reason
So
for that?
this is a question for Bob, from Bob Demento. If you look at the design of the University of Virginia, it looks rather like an Oxford quadrangle, but one side is not enclosed, it's rectangular, with one side that's not enclosed. And you're just looking out into infinity at the time. It is now enclosed, unfortunately, so you can't fully get Jefferson's original vision, but you would have been looking out west, and it would have had a certain contemplative. But in other ways, it is rather similar to the idea of quadrangle. We do know that he owned a set of plates of Oxford and Cambridge with the quadrangles, and also tour guides to both universities. He never cites them, nor do architectural historians, as an influence, but symbolically it makes sense that they saw learning as enclosed and almost like a convent or a monastery. Jefferson never believed that, that learning should be just enclosed, and a great believer in people bringing the practical benefits of their education to a larger public and benefiting their societies. This in many ways relates to your earlier question. He did see the civic importance of education in his Bill for General Diffusion of Knowledge. That was the sole reason he gave for the university. But if you look at all his statements, it's clear that he saw education as very important at a lot of levels, not least self-enrichment. Talking about his own classics education, he said he still thanked his father for giving him that opportunity and how much it had benefited his life, how he continued to read the classics in retirement. And I mentioned he saw Anglo-Saxon as an essential component of a good education, both to understand the legal system, to understand representation. He subscribed to the myth that they had semi-democracies in Anglo-Saxon England, which most people did at the time, but not least for language, in order to really understand the language. He was a great believer in languages and in teaching modern languages. It's one of the first universities to take modern language teaching seriously.
If you don't have any other questions, I think what's left is to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience with our audio quality. We'll take that to the workshop right away. But I do hope that we see you again soon here at the Library Company or see you in virtual space. Have a good evening.